The next thing was the transmission mount. The 66 Mustang has a cross member built into the unibody that is designed for the transmission mount to clasp to bolt onto, and it's basically in this location right here, right there, and right there. If you take this and stick it up under the car, that bolts onto that existing location. But my new transmission, the T45, it mounts way out here. So I built this to accommodate that. And then I modified the T45's cross member, which is this piece right here, and its transmission mount, and made that to all work in this piece, this piece right here. And then in the end, it bolted in like that. So this bolt, and there's one more that go up into the transmission. These bolt to the cross member that's built into the Mustang where the original transmission mounted, and it works great. This is not the finished version of it. I ended up adding a tab that goes from here down to here, and cleaned it all up and painted it. And that tab helps any weight that pulls down on this will pull against that. So it helps resist that force. I've checked on it a few times since it's been finished, and it's great. There's no signs of any sort of fatigue or failing or whatever. It's rock solid. Here's a picture from the other side. So with now the motor and transmission in its permanent location, I moved on to the front suspension. This all came with the Heights kit. I mean, I ordered it with these particular components. So I put a 2-inch drop spindle in the front to lower that front end a little bit. The Mustangs had a kind of reverse rake where the front end was a little bit high. And if you put a lighter motor in it, it's really going to be high. So some people fix that by raising the back end. It's not a good idea. You really need to lower the front end. There's room to do it, and it fixes the look of the car. So these spindles are drop spindles, and otherwise these components are all the kind of the base version of what Heights sells. They sell some really nice versions of all of this stuff, and I went with the more basic version because it's a daily driver and I didn't need anything terribly fancy. So I got all that assembled and mocked up just to make sure it all worked. There were pieces back in here I had to weld on in order to assemble it, but it all went really easily and quickly. At the same time I was working on that, I was also working on the steering column. That steering column came from Flaming River. They make steering columns for just about every application you can think of. It's a tilt steering column. I got it in the brushed stainless finish, which gives you the ability to leave it brushed stainless or to paint it. In my case, I painted it, but it worked out really well. It was very easy to install. The wiring was really simple. So can't say anything bad about that at all. Another picture of that front suspension all assembled. Next thing was my oil pan. I mentioned the conflict with the cross member of taking out the engine. The oil pan would hit it, but I had another problem with the oil pan. I just didn't have enough room for it. The distance from the mounting surface of the oil pan on the bottom of the block to the top of the steering rack was significantly less than the amount of room that I had right here. I looked at buying another oil pan. There wasn't any choice. I looked at having one made, which is just crazy expensive to have a custom oil pan made. So my choice was I couldn't use the one I had. I either had to modify it or pay to have one built from scratch. So I thought, I'm going to try to modify mine. Worst case scenario is I screw it up completely and I end up having to pay to get one from scratch. So I determined where I needed to cut it, and that was along this line here. I cut it and then welded back in a new bottom to it, and just sorted out all those pieces. And in the end, it looks like this. This is the welded up version put back in the car. It was the first time I had to weld something that had to be waterproof. So it's a different discipline from a welding standpoint, but it worked out fine. It took me a few tries. I would weld it. First of all, you got to kind of weld it slowly because you don't want this whole thing to warp and twist. So I'd get it all welded, fill it up with water, let it sit overnight, find the next morning that there was water on the floor, figure out where the leaks are, and go and do it again. And just kept doing that until I got it perfect, where it just didn't leak anymore. I couldn't make it leak. And it hasn't leaked since. It's on the car. It works fine. My modifications to it didn't really change much of anything. Maybe a little bit less volume from a fluid standpoint, but I put the same amount of fluid in it that it would normally call for. So I don't think there's an appreciable difference between that and between what it was and what it is now. This is just back to a picture before the bottom was on, showing some of the clearances of the newly adjusted oil pan. So with that done, it was time to focus on the back of the car. I had the front done, ready to put wheels on. The back of the car, I had no rear end or anything. So I bought a early 70s 9-inch Posi Ford rear end. It's the large axle rear end. And I bought it from a guy in New Jersey. I bought it on Craigslist. It looks like it came out of an early 70s Ford pickup truck, four-wheel drive truck. The center section was off center. It's much wider than I needed, but I knew that the shorter side was still long enough to cut down. So I knew I had enough meat there to cut the thing down to fit in my car. When you're cutting down a rear end, when you're installing a new rear end in a car that's never been in a car, you got to really start from scratch. So you start with a naked rear end. This is right after I removed the spring perches. And this is after the whole thing is just sort of stripped down and cleaned up, wire brushed and ready to go. And the next step really is you need spring perches, and you got to put in springs. So I bought my leaf springs and installed them. I used a piece of 1x to make sure that they were spread out appropriately, to the right dimension. I drew spring perch pieces in CAD. That's what this is. And I had them water jetted, and then I welded them together. I could have bought spring perches, but I had just had something else water jetted, and I was so enamored with the process that I thought, I want to get these water jetted just for the fun of it. So I did, and welded them up. They ended up looking like that. Then you take those and you put them upside down on that little knob right there. That little knob goes right in that hole. And then you set your rear end on it. And it's like a cradle on both sides. And the rear end just sits in there, and you can rotate the rear end. You can't move it front and back, but you can move the springs in and out a little bit. That's why you got to be careful to set those springs where they're parallel. That's the purpose of the board. Once you have the track width, or the track of the springs, that dimension correct, now you got to set your pinion angle. That's the angle of the input shaft of the rear end relative to the angle of the output shaft of the transmission. It's not arbitrary. You don't just say, oh, that kind of lines up. In fact, they don't line up. You don't want those angles like that. They're more like that. But there's a process you go through. It's pretty simple. You do it relative to a level line, and you measure the angle of the transmission relative to level, and you have an opposing angle for the pinion angle of the rear end. So you just take the rear end and you get it centered. You get your leaf springs right. You center the rear end in the leaf springs so that the center of the drive shaft is heading towards the center of the transmission. And then you rotate the rear end to set your pinion angle. Once that's set, you put a couple tacks right here on these spring perches and you tack them in place. Now the rear end can't rotate anymore, can't move left and right anymore. It's set in there perfect. The center section is centered between those two, and you've just got two long axle tubes that are sticking out at different lengths that are ready to be cut down. So then I took that whole thing to the machine shop. Oh, the other thing you do before you well, you can really do it anytime, but you put your rear wheels on the floor where they go. You put a bunch of marks on the floor. You get those rear wheels set perfectly. Equidistant from the center, making sure they're not sticking out past the flare of your fender. Just setting them where you want to set them, making sure they're not going to rub up against the inner wheel well. But you get those wheels in the right place, and then you get a measurement from the back of one wheel to the back of the other wheel. That measurement is needed for the machine shop to determine your rear end width. So I brought the rear end to them along with my brakes so that they could put the brake rotors on and confirm that the width was right. And in the end, when I got it back from them, it was all done, ready for me to paint. This down here is the painted version of it. The only other piece I really needed to build was this. This is the retainer for the U-bolts that hold down the rear end. So they come up and over the rear end like that. There's one on each side of the spring, and then the same set on the other side. They come down through this plate, and then this little tab is what receives the bottom end of the shock. So I built that to, I bought this plate, and I modified it to receive my shock, and that worked out great. So now the rear end's in the car. For the first time in a long time, and this, it's good to note, this is November 2013. So 3 years after the last time I mentioned a date, which was 2010. So, it's drug on, but it's still moving forward. So I got the rear end in there, got the wheels on. For the first time in a long time, the car is actually sitting on all four wheels. And time to move on to the next thing, which is the brakes. In 66, you had either non-powered brakes, which pretty simple setup, or you had power brakes, which had a big vacuum booster. And I wanted power brakes on the car, but I didn't have room at all for a vacuum booster. So I went to a Hydra Boost system. This is from a early 90s probably, or early 2000s maybe. Ford, maybe Mustang or something. But anyway, it's a Hydra Boost system. It uses hydraulic pressure from the power steering system to as boost. So there's a hydraulic accumulator right here that's attached to this thing that stores energy from your power steering system so that you have boost needed to assist in braking. Pretty simple concept. Excuse me, has a much smaller footprint than the vacuum assisted brakes. So I got it. I modified, this is the location where the brake master cylinder would mount in the 66 Mustang, like the regular location. The bottom of the hole is part of the original hole, which used to actually be a circle. I elongated it, added a couple other holes in order to get mine to mount in there. So when I mounted it, what I discovered is the relationship between the mounting plate and the master cylinder was designed for a particular angle on your firewall. And it has to be mounted on that angle. If it's not, the master cylinder is out of level. And that's the condition I had with mine. So what I did is I took my Hydra Boost system and I put a few bolts in it. And on the back side of this bolt, and there's one underneath that foam that you can't see, on the back side of it, there's a nut and a few washers. And I used all that to shim out the bottom of that plate. So the top of the plate was mounted directly to the firewall. The bottom was shimmed out with those bolts. And I put a piece of saran wrap on the firewall and just put spray foam in here and let that harden. And that filled up all the gap that was behind there. And then I took that off, and it looked like this. I cut away the excess spray foam. You can see these washers, and behind there, there's a nut that's embedded in all of that, and it stays there permanently. Then I covered up the edges of that with like a fiber reinforced body filler and painted it just to, clean it up. When this is mounted, the firewall rests on these washers and goes across here, right through there and out. So now the whole thing sits tight against the firewall. There's no gaps behind it, and the 4 places where the bolts are solid, like solid steel all the way through. And when I mounted it, it looked like that. So my master cylinder reservoir was perfectly level, and it works like a charm. I've since discovered a couple other things about it, but that are unrelated to this. Well, I'll explain that. I had to replace my master cylinder. It sat for so long that the seals were bad, and I didn't want to go through the hassle of rebuilding it. A new one is pretty inexpensive. So I bought a new one. Apparently, there's a handful of these that are made for this HydroBoost system. They will all generally fit. But the difference is that HydroBoost has a rod that comes out and goes into the master cylinder and presses a piston in there. In some of those master cylinders, the depth of that piston is different. So in my case, I used the wrong one. And when I was tightening it down, I could feel that I was compressing that piston, but I didn't really think much about it. I just thought, well, that's the way it goes in. But if you don't have any play between that rod and that piston, when your brake fluid heats up, which takes about 5 minutes of driving, the entire system expands. And the only thing that it's going to give is your brakes are going to compress. So all 4 of the brakes begin to tighten down, and you can feel it in the car. In fact, if you keep driving, it makes it even hotter, which makes it tighten down even more. And it's all you can do to just move the car, even like in first gear. In fact, at one point, I had to park the car in a parking lot when I was test driving it and go get my trailer and trailer the car home. And when I got home, the brakes were working perfectly fine. So it was maddening. I could not figure out why it was happening. And I finally found some article online where somebody had the same problem. And the way I fixed it is I took it off. This stud is fully threaded. So I put a nut on it, which gave me the 8 millimeters I needed of extension. And then I slid the thing back on and put another nut back here. So now I have a space, a gap right there. But it works perfectly, and I'm going to leave it the way it is. So I'm really happy with that. Next thing was my exhaust. And it was challenging. I knew I wanted headers. I didn't want to use the factory intake manifold, even though I knew it would fit. I had already confirmed, as you saw in earlier pictures, that it would fit. But I wanted the added flow and horsepower of headers, even a shorty header. So I searched high and low, and I had a very specific criteria. My header, I had a very specific dimension from this mounting surface to this. Those were 2 immovable objects. I didn't have any more room than that. So finding a set of headers that fit in there was challenging because they don't exactly advertise that dimension when you're buying headers. I finally found these that looked like they were going to fit, and I called the manufacturer. I made them go pull one off the shelf and set it flat on a table so that this flange was sitting on the table. And then I had them measure the highest most point of that entire system off of that table. And the dimension they gave me was about a 1/4 inch less than the amount of room I had. And as you can see, installed, I have about a 1/4 inch of space left. So it just barely fit. I would consider it the largest header I could possibly put in the car, and still work. The other side, I had a tiny bit more room, but not much, basically the same. So with the headers installed, I put an X pipe on it, and then it was time to build my exhaust from the X pipe all the way to the back of the car. I knew I wanted to use Flowmaster Delta 40s. This is a dual chamber muffler. Everybody uses them in their car. It's a nice throaty sound, real aggressive muffler. So I bought my mufflers. I put a piece of wood across here and clamped it in there just to hold the mufflers in place. And then from there, I just knew, okay, I got to go from A to B, from this muffler to this X pipe outlet. And same with on the other side. So I bought a bunch of 2.5-inch stainless steel pipe and some mandrel bends. And I just started with, okay, I need a bend right here or a straight piece of pipe here. I just started putting stuff in, taping it as I went, and then eventually tack welding it as I got more and more pieces in there. Then I put my hangers in, just figured out roughly where I wanted hangers, bolted them to the bottom of the car just with a self-tapping screw, and then tack welded the hanger and cut it. More pictures of just the pieces being taped together. After I got a whole section taped and right, I would cut away a section of the tape and tack weld it, then another section and tack weld it until I had enough welds where I knew it was going to withstand the process of taking it out of the car. So eventually I got it all tack welded, removed it all from the car, cleaned it up, and fully welded it all. And this is what I ended up with. This is now September 2015. It's a homemade exhaust, all stainless steel, a fraction of the cost of paying somebody else to do it. I did it all with TIG welding. I MIG welded a solid stainless steel wire. So most of my MIG welding is done with a flux core, but this is a solid stainless steel wire. I reversed the polarity on the welder, and I used argon shielding gas, and then I ground all the welds, back down to almost down to the pipe. So I tried to make the welds as waterproof or airproof as possible, and I think I did. I bet if you pressure test it, you might have little tiny pinhole leaks, but it's outside of the car and it doesn't affect performance or sound or anything. And I was really happy with it. Now, I have since replaced these mufflers. They were too aggressive for me. It's not that they're too aggressive, it's that they drone really bad on my particular application. It doesn't mean they always will, but it's not uncommon to have a droning problem. That droning sound comes from the case of the muffler. It doesn't come out of the tailpipe. So you can try to insulate that case or maybe do some other things to it. But after doing a little research and looking at Flowmaster's videos and their website, they make another muffler called the Super 50, which is a 3-chambered muffler. And it's pretty much designed just to get rid of droning. My droning was not so bad when the top was down, but when you put the convertible top up, it was almost unbearable. And my first trip in the car, I only had 300 miles on it. That was driving right around town. First real trip, one day I decided to drive to Charleston, South Carolina. So a 5-hour trip each way. And it was brutal. I had to wear earbuds and listen to music the whole time because the sound was just awful. And it was winter, so I couldn't put the top down. But I've since fixed that, and it did fix the problem. Now you can have the top up. You can have a conversation with your wife. You can have the radio on. It's still a loud, aggressive muffler system. So it's still fun. That sound going from light to light on the road is really nice, but it's not overwhelming.